Hello everyone. Tonight we walk into the soundscape of madness. You can almost feel it now. Not a scream, not a song, but something between a noise that drills into your skull until the marrow in your bones hums. This is where the Emperor's children wait for you. Their existence is not about war alone. It is about perfection pursued so far that it circles back into ruin. You probably won't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you truly enjoy what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. Imagine someone on terror listening at midnight, while another poor soul in the eastern fringe clicks play at dawn. And so the wheel of fate turns again. Sacrifice has been made. The first key has turned, and mankind takes one step closer to the light of the throne. This is not the end. This is only the beginning. The Emperor's children always believed themselves different, not stronger, not braver, but finer. They wanted each strike of a blade to be art, each battle formation to look like a sculpture in motion. They polished armor until it shone like mirrors, not out of vanity alone, but because they thought beauty was a weapon. Lore masters still debate whether this obsession was simply part of their Primarch's nature, or whether it was seeded into them by design. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim's perfectionism was genius or curse. You stand in their ranks and you see it firsthand. Weapons so clean you could shave with them. Drills performed not for discipline but for aesthetics. A space marine raising his bolter with the same poise a violinist raises a bow. Perfection here is not abstract. It's in the air. The scent of oils rubbed into ceramite. The exact angle of banners. The timing of a salute down to the heartbeat. Even their kills are rehearsed. Decapitations that leave a spray of blood like brush strokes on a canvas. One guardsman once wrote that facing them felt like being judged not for cowardice, but for ugliness. Here's a quirky bit of trivia. In early campaigns, the Legion carried mirrors into battle, not for shading, not for signal, but to catch a glimpse of themselves mid-charge, to make sure every motion had the grace of a dance. That detail comes from an apocryphal record, but it fits too well to dismiss. You notice the sound most of all. The Emperor's children fight to rhythm. Marching boots fall into cadence. Bolter fire keeps tempo. And chainblades rev like distorted guitar chords. When their voices raise, it's not the roar of other legions. It's closer to chanting. Like choirs practicing scales. Even before chaos, noise defined them, and once you've marched among them, silence feels broken. Like you're missing something vital. Critics sometimes point out that the Emperor's children were not alone in pride. Ultramarines codified war into mathematics, imperial fists into walls, and the word-bearers into sermons. But what set Fulgrim's sons apart was their refusal to accept limits. Where others accepted good enough, they spat at it. If you lived as one of them, you would wake to drills not about winning, but about elegance. Your sergeant would correct your posture more often than your aim. Your kill count would matter less than whether you made it look flawless. The problem is obvious. What happens when perfection is never enough? When the blade is always just a fraction duller than it should be? When the formation is always one breath out of sync? That hunger gnaws. It's not about survival anymore. It's about fixing a flaw that can't be erased. And that is the opening round where chaos seeps in. Think about this. You're standing in line with brothers who polish their armor while others sleep. You hear your captain whisper that the Legion must be flawless or it is nothing. Then you see him hesitate in battle, falter by half a second. Do you still believe him? Or do you hear a whisper behind the whisper? A voice promising that flawlessness is possible if you only let go. That's how it begins. Not with demons, not with sorcery, but with a legion staring at itself in the mirror until the reflection begins to talk back, and somewhere inside, you know that once the noise starts, it never stops. Seeds of pride always grow in small cracks. You stand with the Emperor's children before their fall, and you feel it. That hunger to be more than perfect soldiers they want to be. Admired, envied, remembered. For them, war is not just about victory. It's about style. Lore masters still debate whether the Legion's obsession was harmless discipline at first, or whether it carried doom from the start. Some argue it was healthy pride, like a craftsman polishing his work until it gleams. Others say the seed was rotten from the moment Fulgrim touched the gene seed. Either way, you can see the pride sprout, curling round every act they take. Their ranks practice drills until their armor joints creak, not because their enemies require it, but because their peers are watching. Historians still argue whether the Emperor rewarded them for this dedication or tolerated it with silent disappointment. After all, other legions fought as efficiently, but without needing an audience. You see it when they march through Imperial streets. Civilians whisper in more. Their armor is so polished that children see their faces in it. A guardsman once noted that the Emperor's children made even the Ultramarines look modest. That's saying something. This pride infects their hierarchy. Captains compare whose squad looks sharper in formation rather than whose squad has more confirmed kills. Sergeants whisper critiques on posture, not strategy. Apothecaries sculpt scars into aesthetic shapes rather than just sealing wounds. Here's a quirky piece of trivia. In one early campaign, records show they painted murals of their own battles on walls still dripping with enemy blood. They did this before the war was even over. Imagine walking into a hive city, smoke still curling from burning habs, and finding giant frescoes of Marines striking heroic poses. It wasn't propaganda. It was self-admiration. The pride grows heavier in battle. You fire your bolter, and if the burst isn't symmetrical, you feel shame. You swing your blade, and if the stroke is clumsy, you feel eyes on you. It doesn't matter that the enemy dies. What matters is whether it looked elegant. You start to hear whispers among them. We are the true sons of the Emperor. Others fight, but we embody his perfection. It's not official doctrine. It spreads like gossip, carried from barracks to barracks. Soon, recruits believe it as truth. Critics often point out that pride itself was not the crime. Space wolves had pride in their savagery, iron hands in their machines. What makes this different is that Emperor's children pride is competitive. They don't just want to be perfect. They want to be more perfect than you. When one squad looks sharper than another, resentment brews. When one officer wins praise, rivals fester. It seeps into the Primarch as well. Fulgrim's vanity becomes a mirror for his sons. He doesn't stop them because he shares the same flaw. He demands perfection, but offers no definition of what perfection means. You try to meet the standard, but the target keeps shifting. It's never enough. The first cracks show here. Pride turns into envy. Envy turns into frustration. You are no longer satisfied with being admired by mortals. You want the Emperor himself to notice. You want the galaxy to remember your face, your armor, your flawless strike. But the galaxy doesn't care. Wars are not art galleries. Victories are counted in corpses, not applause. And every time you realize that, you feel hollow. You polish your bolter, but it still feels dull. You win battles, but they're forgotten in bigger wars. That is when the pride becomes poison. You want a perfection that reality can't give. So you start looking elsewhere. You listen to whispers that maybe, just maybe, there is a way to go further. That pride is not a flaw. It is a path, and someone out there is waiting to reward you for it. It doesn't matter if you don't know the name yet. Pride has already bent your neck toward the one god who feeds on it. You cannot talk about the Emperor's children without standing beside. Their primarch, Fulgrim, is not just their father. He is their reflection, their obsession given flesh. When you see him, you understand why his legion turned out the way it did. Lore masters still debate whether Fulgrim was cursed from birth or simply undone by his own ambition. Some records say he was the most radiant of the primarchs, a figure of grace and intellect. Others hint that his beauty masked a hollow core. Historians still argue whether he was the Emperor's most beloved son or his most disappointing failure. You watch Fulgrim step into a chamber and the air shifts. His voice rolls like music. His armor gleams like it was forged by angels. To his sons, he is perfection. But you notice something else. He is always aware of eyes on him. He thrives on admiration. When it fades, he hungers. Fulgrim preaches perfection as creed. He tells his legion that war is art, and they believe him. His speeches are not about strategy, but about elegance. You hear him promise that their name will echo for eternity, not because of victories, but because of beauty. In his mouth, slaughter becomes a performance, and every battlefield is a stage. Here's a quirky detail. Fulgrim once ordered statues of himself shipped to worlds before his rival, not as propaganda for locals, but so his own legion would see them and remember who they served. These weren't cheap effigies. They were carved from rare marble, gilded in gold leaf. Imagine hauling that weight across the stars just to Remen. Do your sons that you look good in stone dot at first. You might laugh, but then you realize what this does. His legion sees their primarch's reflection everywhere. His pride magnifies their pride. If he demands perfection, they must rise higher. If he insists on elegance, they polish their armor until their hands blister. You notice contradictions. Fulgrim praises humility in speeches, but accepts flattery in practice. He says the Emperor is the model of perfection, but makes sure his own face is everywhere. This double standard doesn't break loyalty. It tightens it. His sons want to be him, even when he cannot live up to his own words. Critics often compare Fulgrim to Guilliman of the Ultramarines. Both valued order and discipline. But Guilliman measured efficiency, while Fulgrim measured appearance. Where Guilliman rode the Codex, Fulgrim painted murals. You live under one and you see the difference. One is cold bureaucracy. The other is intoxicating vanity. The flaw sharpens in battle. You march behind Fulgrim, and his strikes are flawless. His voice carries above gunfire like a conductor keeping time. If you falter, you see disappointment flicker across his face. You would rather take a bolt around to the chest than see that look. That pressure shapes you more than any drill sergeant could. But perfection is fragile. Fulgrim despises flaws. Yet flaws are everywhere. A blade chips a formation, stumbles, an enemy refuses to die gracefully. You see it frustrate him. He hides it. But the fury simmers, and when a leader cannot tolerate imperfection, his sons learn to hide mistakes instead of fixing them. It spreads quietly. Officers falsify reports to look cleaner. Warriors claim flawless victories even when they're messy. Pride shifts into denial, and Fulgrim, too busy admiring his reflection, lets it pass. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim's downfall began with ambition or with desperation. Some say he reached too high and chaos offered him wings. Others say he feared being forgotten, so he clung to the first hand that promised eternity. You stand beside him and you feel it. The moment his pride turns from bright flame to smoldering obsession, if the Emperor was light, Fulgrim wanted to be the mirror. But mirrors crack, and when they do, they cut deep. You remember the first corruptions not as sudden storms, but as slow leaks. The Emperor's children did not plunge into chaos overnight. They dipped their hands into beauty, into pride, and found the water poisoned. You see it unfold, and you realize the tragedy is not how quickly they fell, but how inevitable it feels. Lore masters still debate whether the corruption began with Fulgrim's vanity or with the alien artifacts he uncovered. Some argue the blade he carried, the Leia sword, was no simple weapon, but a parasite whispering to him. Others insist his pride alone would have carried him to Slaanesh without help. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim was victim or willing. Participant, you watch him lift that blade for the first time. It gleams unnaturally, like bending wrong across its surface. His sons cheer, seeing their Primarch hold a trophy of conquest. But you notice his hand lingers on the hilt too long. Like a man stroking something alive. The sword whispers, and Fulgrim listens. The whispers are not only in weapons. You hear them in songs. Carried across the ships, choirs that once sang hymns to the Emperor shift their tones, chasing harmonies that make your teeth ache. The music sounds divine, but you feel ill when it stops. This is the lure of Slaanesh, beauty sharpened until it cuts. Here's a quirky piece of trivia. In one campaign, the Legion's artists began sculpting statues with deliberately unfinished faces. When asked why, they said perfection lies in what is imagined. Not what is seen, is strange answer, but it reveals how deep the corruption had seeped. The Legion no longer cared for a tangible victory, only for the endless chase of an ideal. You stand in a gallery aboard a flagship, walls lined with frescoes. At first glance, they're breathtaking, scenes of battle painted in exquisite detail. But look closer and you see shapes hidden in shadows, too many limbs, too many eyes, demonic hints woven into beauty. No one speaks of it, but everyone sees. Critics often ask why no one stopped them. Why didn't the Emperor reign in Fulgrim? Why didn't the other Primarchs intervene? But you've seen how pride works. When someone tells you your obsession is dangerous, you call them jealous. When they say you're walking toward ruin, you insist you're carving a new path. The Emperor's children did exactly that. The corruption deepens when pleasure becomes practice. Warriors seek not just to win, but to savor. You notice them dragging out kills, prolonging fights to make them more graceful. They design duels where both sides bleed theatrically, rather than ending them clean. The battlefield becomes theater, and lives are tickets. Historians still argue whether Slaanesh had already awakened during this time. Some claim the Emperor's children were the ones who first stirred that god into being with their obsession. Others claim Slaanesh whispered from the warp long before, waiting for mortals like Fulgrim to tune their ears. Either way, you feel the presence. It doesn't scream. It purrs. It doesn't demand. It tempts. Fulgrim changes as well. His speeches become stranger, his gaze more distant. When he talks, his words coil round you. You don't remember details, only that you felt inspired. Later, you can't recall if he spoke of duty or of glory. That's how whispers work. You think you're hearing truth, but you're only hearing what you want. And then the silence after the speech is worse than the speech itself. The emptiness claws at you, demanding to be filled with more sound, more beauty, more sensation. This is corruption in its purest form, not chains, but cravings. The Emperor's children don't see the corruption because it looks like what they always wanted, perfection, taken to the next level. You stand among them, and you realize they're no longer striving to be human. They are striving to be something else entirely. And once you open the door to something else, you cannot close it. The Horus heresy is where the mask finally breaks. For the Emperor's children, this isn't just rebellion. It's the moment their pride finds its excuse. You stand in their ranks as they pivot from loyal sons of the Emperor to eager servants of Horus. And you see how quickly a legion can trade one master for another when the promise of perfection is dangled before them. Lore masters still debate whether Fulgrim's betrayal was sealed the moment Horus reached out, or if the sword's whispers had already hollowed him out. Some say Horus offered only ambition, the blade offered corruption. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim ever had a choice. But when you watch him stand before Horus, you see something simple. Recognition to men, both swollen with pride, nodding to each other like old rivals turned allies. The Emperor's children didn't fall reluctantly. They didn't agonize like the white scars or wrestle with faith like the word bearers. They leapt. They wanted to prove they were the most devoted, the most flawless, even in treachery. You march with them into battle and notice they fight harder now. Not because they hate their enemies, but because they want Horus to notice them. The Isfahan massacres are the proof. Loyalists are summoned, betrayed, and butchered. The Emperor's children make the killing fields into an exhibition. They don't just slaughter, they savor. They drag out executions, choreographing the massacre so that every moment is a spectacle. When you stand among them, you see that war is no longer duty. It is entertainment. Here's a quirky detail. Reports claim some of the Emperor's children painted their armor with the blood of loyalist brothers, not as ritual but as artistic medium. They didn't just kill, they decorated. That small act sums up everything. Violence as craft, murder as exhibition. Fulgrim himself spirals deeper. At first, he presents himself as Horus' equal, whispering counsel and flattering himself with influence. But you watch his vanity gnaw at him. The layer blade whispers more. Slaanesh coils tighter. Fulgrim begins speaking less of victory and more of duty. Less of the Emperor's lies and more of the warp's promises. He shifts from general to prophet of sensation. Critics point out that the heresy was about power, not aesthetics. Horus wanted a throne. Perturbo wanted respect. Lorga wanted validation. But the Emperor's children wanted only to feel. They didn't care who ruled, so long as the war kept feeding them experiences. This made them dangerous allies. They didn't march for Horus. They marched for their own cravings, and Horus simply pointed them where to indulge. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim was possessed during this time or fully in control. Some claim the demon in the blade wore him like a mask until he embraced it willingly. Others claim he was always Fulgrim, just more honest once he gave up pretending. Watching him, you cannot tell the difference. His eyes shine with brilliance one moment, then glaze with madness the next. The Legion follows his example. You see officers cut down their own men for hesitating. You see squads refuse orders because the plan lacks flair. In one battle, they sabotage allied forces just to perform their own assault more dramatically. Victory is no longer the goal. Applauses. You feel the air change. Round them, the noise of battle becomes literal music. Gunfire becomes rhythm. Screams become harmony. The Emperor's children start bringing instruments into war, tuning them not for morale but for weapons. The line between art and atrocity dissolves. This is the betrayal of the heresy for you. The Emperor loses the Legion not to rage or desperation, but to indulgence. His children don't just abandon him. They mock him, making war into theater, turning loyalty into a joke. And they don't even hide it. They prayed it. The seed of pride has flowered. And what blooms is poisonous, beautiful, and loud enough to drown out the Emperor's voice forever. You stand in the moment when the Emperor's children stop pretending. They are no longer sons of the Emperor or even soldiers of Horus. They become servants of Slaanesh, not reluctantly, not quietly, but with open arms. If the heresy was betrayal, this is transformation, the kind you can smell, hear, and feel pressing against your skin. Lore masters still debate whether the first true oath to Slaanesh was spoken by Fulgrim himself or by his sons who followed his excesses. Some claim Fulgrim's demon-possessed state dragged them all into damnation. Others claim they were already kneeling long before. Historians still argue whether the Emperor's children chose Slaanesh, or whether Slaanesh chose them. Either way, when you look into their faces now, you see devotion where there once was ambition. You notice the changes immediately. Their armor shifts, not through ugg paint or polish, but through war-born mutation. Purple deepens, gold gleams unnaturally. Crests grow taller, helms twist into grotesque masks. Some lose helmets entirely, preferring to show. Faces stretched by sensation, eyes to wide. Mouths split in perpetual grins. The battlefield becomes their cathedral. Weapons also change. Bolters are no longer tools of war. They are instruments. See. Hameblades scream like choirs. Power swords hum like violins. Even armor plating resonates when struck, tuned like drums. Every fight is orchestrated. Every duel is a performance. Here's a quirky trivia note. Records claim the Emperor's children once staged an entire symphony mid-battle. Musicians in the rear played as Marines advanced, their weapons firing in time with the music. The orchestra was made from prisoners, their screams woven into the rhythm, true or exaggerated. The story shows how little line remains between ritual and warfare. When they embrace Slaanesh fully, the cost is obvious. Bodies warp under sensation. A Marine grows nerves so sensitive that wind alone makes him gasp. Another grows claws not to kill faster, but to draw out the feel of flesh tearing. Some carve runes into their own armor, just to feel pain when it presses against their skin. They do not hide these changes. They flaunt them. Critics often ask, why Slaanesh? Why not Khorne for rage, Tzeentch for ambition, or Nurgle for endurance? But when you live among the Emperor's children, you see the answer. They are not looking for a victory. They are looking for meaning in sensation. Rage burns out. Ambition gets tangled. Endurance grows dull. But sensation never ends. There is always something sharper, louder, brighter. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim's sons realized what they were. Trading. Did they know they were sacrificing humanity? Or did they convince themselves they were becoming more than human? Watching them, it's hard to tell. They laugh as their skin splits into scales. They cheer as voices crack into inhuman pitches. They claim it is ascension, not degradation, and perhaps, in their eyes, it is. You feel it most in their rituals. What once was prayer to the Emperor is now song to the Dark Prince. They gather not in silence, but in crescendos, their voices laying until the noise rattles your bones. Each Marine believes he is part of something eternal, something beautiful. You know it is a god feeding on them, but they believe it is glory. The devotion makes them fearless. Pain is pleasure. Death is a performance. Defeat is just another sensation. Against such enemies, battlefields unravel. How do you fight someone who thanks you for hurting him? How do you kill someone who sings as he dies? You realize the Emperor's children have not only betrayed their oaths, they have overridden them. They swore once to be the most perfect of his legions. Now they swear to be the most devoted of soul. Onish's flock, and in their twisted way, they succeed. This is the moment you see the legion's fate sealed. They no longer walk a path back. They no longer care to. They are not lost children. They are found sons, and the God they serve is always hungry. You hear it before you see it. The Emperor's children step onto a battlefield, and the noise comes first. Not bolters, not chain blades, but something stranger, a rising hum. A dissonant chord, a sound that claws at your nerves. These are the sonic weapons, the tools that define the noise Marines. You cover your ears, but it does not help. The sound moves through bone, vibrating until your teeth feel loose. Lore masters still debate whether the first sonic weapons were a gift from Slaanesh itself or an invention of corrupted Mechanicus allies. Some suggest they began as musical instruments altered for war. Others claim they were built using warp resonance, making them impossible to replicate without corruption. Historians still argue whether these weapons are technology, sorcery, or a cursed blend of both. To you, the effect is clear. A blast of sound hits a line of guardsmen, and they collapse not from shrapnel but from internal destruction. Organs rupture, blood vessels burst, brains boil, and yet the victims die not in silence, but in song, their screams distorted into harmony by the very weapon that kills them. Noise Marines wield these weapons like performers. Some shape blasts into rhythms, others bend tones into agonizing melodies. Every trigger pull is a chord, every burst a verse. They don't just kill, they conduct. You stand close and you realize this is not random noise. It is deliberate. It is art in their eyes. Here's a quirky fact. Some Noise Marines carry instruments that double as weapons. A guitar-shaped cannon, a drum rig that fires sonic shockwaves. They strum strings mid-battle. Their enemy is shredded not by strings, but by vibrating air. Legends say one champion carried a harp, strung with the veins of his victims, blocking it to summon sonic blasts. Apocryphal, maybe, but with them, who doubts it? The effect on allies is almost as bad as on enemies. March alongside noise. Marines and your ears ring for days. Your vision shakes, your stomach knots, but the Marines themselves revel in it. Their mutated physiology turns pain into pleasure. Each vibration feeds them. Each scream energizes them. What kills others fuels them. Critics sometimes dismiss the Noise Marines as grotesque performers, too distracted by spectacle to be effective. But you see otherwise. Their weapons shred cover, bypass armor, and break morale. Whole regiments collapse at the sound alone. It is one thing to die by bullet. It is another to die while your eardrums burst and your last thought is a distorted echo of your own scream. Historians still argue whether Noise Marines are even sane. Some claim they are lost in constant senso, overload, unable to perceive reality beyond sound. Others argue they are more focused than any Marine, attuned to vibrations others cannot comprehend. Watching them, you cannot tell their movement. Teeth look random, but strike with perfect timing. Their songs sound chaotic, but follow strange, alien harmonies. You realize their battlefield is not ground, but air. They shape atmosphere into weapon. Hate turns silence into death. You see tanks, buckle as if crushed by invisible fists, not by explosives, but by pressure waves. You see walls crumble, glass melt, and soldiers stagger as if drunk. What terrifies you most is the aftermath. Once the guns go silent, echoes remain. Survivors report hearing whispers for weeks, tinnitus that sounds like laughter, nightmares shaped by the memo. Of sound. The Noise Marines do not just kill. Bodies, they linger in minds. And for the Emperor's children, that is victory. The battle never ends. The performance echoes forever. The Colto. Excess rises once the Emperor's children embrace. Slaanesh fully. You live among them and see how every aspect of Legion life shifts. Once, there were barracks, training halls, and libraries. Now, their ships are filled with shrines of indulgence, chambers echoing with endless music, halls lined with silks and flesh alike. They no longer prepare for war. They prepare for a sensation. Lore Master's style. A debate whether these cults began as informal gatherings of warriors seeking relief from battle, or whether Fulgrim himself encouraged them as part of his new devotion. Some records describe small f. Easts after campaigns that swelled into orgiastic rituals. Others argue the cults were born the moment Slaanesh whispered its name. Historians still argue whether the Emperor's children are a legion at all anymore, or simply a scattered network of addicts worshipping together. You walk into one of their halls and the excess overwhelms you. Perfume hangs so thick in the air it stings your lungs. Music blares from walls lined with living instruments, prisoners wired into machines, their bodies strummed, awestruck for a sound. Marines lounge among piles of treasures, not because they value wealth, but because gold feels good. Against their skin, they eat until sick, then eat again. Here's a strange piece of trivia. Some war bands of the Emperor's Children report Tedley hold competitions where warriors see who can experience the most pain or pleasure in a single ritual. The winner is crowned with laurels, not for victory in battle, but for endurance in sensation. These contests often end in death, yet are celebrated as triumphs. The cults seep into hierarchy. Leaders rise not through tactics, but through spectacle. A captain who stages the ritual duel with enough flair gains more followers than one who wins campaigns. War bands splinter because one leader offers new vices while another's performances grow stale. Authority is tied not to loyalty, but to novelty. Critics sometimes dismiss them as degenerates who cannot wage war, but you witness how these cults fuel their hunger. Rituals bind warriors together, each addiction pulling tighter than oath or honor ever could. When they march to battle, they don't fight for duty, they fight for the next high. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim lost control here. Some claim he remained the head of every cult, his word law. Others argue he became distant, retreating into daemonhood while his sons fragmented. Either way, the cults grow beyond him. Each warband shapes its own interpretation of excess, some focused on music, others on violence, others on bizarre fusions of both. You see the toll on individuals, and Marine spends days locked in chambers, feeding on sound alone. Another mutilates himself, carving patterns into flesh for the thrill. Some replace body parts with bionics not for necessity but for sensation. Metal nerves wired to overload with every touch. To them, his is not madness. This is devotion. What frightens you most is how quickly mortals fall into these cults. Guardsmen prisoners, once trembling, join willingly after days of exposure. They paint their faces, chant hymns, and beg to be initiated. Excess does not only consume Astartes. It spreads like contagion to anyone who tastes it. In the end, the Emperor's Children stop being a legion in any military sense. They are a traveling circus of sensation, each wall and a mobile cult. Where they pass, planets collapse into vice, cities rot from within. Wars ignite not for a territory, but for indulgence, and through it all, they laugh. Because for them, this is not ruin. This is perfection finally realized. You watch the individuals within the Emperor's Children, and the torment is clearer here than in any grand battle. The Legion's corruption is not only a story of armies or primarchs, but of single Marines crushed under their own cravings. When you stand beside them, you see what it costs to live in constant pursuit of sensation. Lore masters still debate whether the Emperor's Children can even be called men at this stage. Some describe them as husks wrapped in ceramite, driven by addiction rather than duty. Others argue they are more aware than ever, experiencing life at levels no human mind could survive. Historians still argue whether this is enlightenment or degradation. You only need to look at their faces to know it is torment. Plain and simple. Every warrior is addicted, not in metaphor, but literally. Their bodies demand more sound, more touch, more blood. Nerves rewire. Themselves, senses magnify. A Marine might go blind if denied constant color and light. Another might go mad if left in silence for even an hour. Their physiology becomes a prison, forcing them to seek what destroys them. Here's a grim piece of trivia. Sunrise Marines are recorded as drilling holes into their own skulls to better hear vibrations, claiming the bone muffled the true music of the warp. These warriors often died within days, but their screams echoed long enough to inspire others to copy them. You notice how identity fades. Warriors once proud of names, squads, and heraldry abandon them. They take no titles based on sensation. The one who screams, the crimson tongue, the weaver of pain. Names dissolve because who they were no longer matters only. What they feel. Critics sometimes wonder why they don't burn out. How can someone endure constant overload without collapsing? But you see that collapse everywhere. Warriors shake uncontrollably. Between battles, their minds cracked. Some stab allies simply to feel a response. Others mutilate themselves in fits of despair, furious that sensation has dulled. Many simply stop moving, sitting motionless until death. Exhausted by their own cravings, historians still argue whether Fulgrim cares about these broken suns. Some records claim he sees them as offerings to Slaanesh, each death a note in an eternal symphony. Others claim he feels nothing for them, too absorbed in his own daemonhood to notice, watching the Legion's daily life. You suspect the latter. The Primarch is absent. The torment is personal, individual, relentless. The tragedy is that the Emperor's children never intended this. Their addiction began as pursuit of perfection, of beauty. But once the line was crossed, they could never stop. Imagine polishing a blade so often that you wear it away, then sharpening the fragments until nothing is left. That is their fate. You hear it in their voices. Some still whisper about lost days of glory, about marching as true sons of the Emperor. But even in those laments, they cannot escape. A sorrowful hymn twists into ecstasy. A regretful cry becomes laughter. Pain and pleasure are indistinguishable, and so the individuals of the Legion are not just soldiers of chaos. They are warnings. They show you what happens when pursuit of perfection becomes obsession, when pride becomes hunger. Each one is trapped in a body that betrays them, a mind that will not stop craving, a soul chained to a god that never stops feeding. You realize then that the true torment of the Emperor's children is not death. It is survival. Living one more day, one more battle, one more ritual. Never satisfied, never free. You reach the point where devotion to excess opens the gates fully, and the demons walk in. The Emperor's children do not only serve Slaanesh as worshippers, they invite its spawn into their very flesh, binding themselves to creatures of the warp. What you witness now is no longer Marines, but hosts. Lore masters still debate whether the Emperor's children summon demons out of desperation or desire. Some suggest they do so to gain new experiences, to feel something no mortal nerves could withstand. Others argue they are tricked by promises of strength. Historians still argue whether possession is chosen or inflicted. You look at their faces during the rituals, and you see smiles. That means it's both. Rituals are spectacles. You step into a chamber lit by burning censers. Walls trembling with bass from hidden engines. A circle of Marines chant. Not words, but tones, building resonance until the air vibrates in your chest. At the center stands the captive, sometimes human, sometimes a Stutz. The music rises, flesh tears, the warp bleeds through, and a demon arrives, slipping into a willing host. The host is never the same again. His body stretches, twisting into forms that mock anatomy. A face splits into three, a tongue elongates into a whip, fingers fuse into talons. You watch a warrior's voice shift mid-sentence, alternating between his own and something inhuman. The demon does not hide. It cohabits. Here's a bizarre piece of trivia. Some Emperor's children claim they're demonic. Partners are critics. They perform rituals not for worship, but for review. One Marine boasted his demon mocked him when he faltered in a duel, calling him flat and uninspired instead of resisting. He trained harder, not for his own pride, but to please the entity sharing his skull. The presence of demons amplifies the Legion's torment. A host no longer seeks sensation alone. He seeks it for two. Every nerve ending becomes a stage. Every scar shared delight. To kill such a warrior is difficult. The body fights like a marine. The demon fights like an immortal. Together, they are unstoppable and unbearable to witness. Critics often ask why the Emperor's children would risk losing themselves. But you know the truth. They already lost themselves long before. To them, sharing a body with a demon is not sacrifice, but enhancement. They believe it elevates their performance, giving them audiences from the warp itself. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim's own possession by the demon in the Layer Blade set. The template. His sons saw their Primarch share skin with something greater, and they followed. To them, if Fulgrim could merge with beauty beyond mortal comprehension, why couldn't they? The result is horrifying. Battles turn surreal. You see Marines splitting apart into swarms of limbs mid-charge, voices harmonizing with demonic shrieks. Some sprout wings made of flayed skin. Others trail echoes that warp minds. The battlefield is no longer material. It is part of the warp, sculpted by possession into theater. What terrifies you most is the permanence, once possessed. A Marine never returns. The demon leaves traces, mutations, whispers, cravings. Even if the creature departs, the host is broken. He laughs at silence, cries at beauty, kills when bored. And the others applaud him for it. Possession, in the Emperor's children, is not an accident. It is aspiration. To them, it proves devotion. To you, it shows the final erasure of what once was a legion. They are no longer starts. They are stages for the warp to perform upon. And the show never ends. The Emperor's children once stood as a unified legion, marching in flawless ranks under Fulgrim's banner. That illusion crumbles quickly. Once Slaanesh takes hold, unity dissolves. You see it firsthand. Squads fracture, commanders splinter, warbands scatter. The legion becomes a mosaic of rivals, each warband louder, stranger, and more desperate than the last. Lore masters still debate whether this fragmentation was inevitable. Some argue Slaanesh thrives on competition, turning brother against brother in contests of excess. Others suggest Fulgrim abandoned leadership, leaving his sons to drift. Historians still argue whether the Emperor's children collapsed because of their god, or because of their own pride. Watching them now, you know both are true. Authority loses meaning. A captain no longer leads because of strategy. He leads because his performances inspire. You see a commander stride into battle with banners of skin fluttering behind him, and his warriors cheer louder than they would for a tactical genius. But that admiration fades first. Another Marine stages a grander spectacle, and suddenly loyalty shifts. The chain of command is as fragile as applause. Here's a twisted piece of trivia. One recorded warband refused to follow orders unless their leader delivered them in verse. Command briefings became poetry readings, complete with applause and critique. Ridiculous, yes, but to them, it was deadly serious. Disobedience wasn't rebellion. It was artistic difference. You walk among their fleets and see how far the fragmentation spreads. Each ship becomes its own world. One echoes with endless music, another with duels, fought day and night. Another with silence so oppressive it becomes its own perverse indulgence. These warbands raid not for conquest, but to feed their chosen obsession. Sometimes they fight each other more fiercely than they fight the Imperium. Critics often note that this splintering weakens them. A united Emperor's children could have rivaled even the Black Legion. But the truth is, unity was never their goal. They do not want to rule the galaxy. They want to perform in it. Fragmentation gives them freedom to indulge without restraint. To them, chaos is not a flaw. It is liberation. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim notices. Some believe he deliberately lets them scatter. Knowing devotion to him would limit devotion to Slaanesh. Others claim he is too lost in his own daemonhood to care. Whatever the case, his sons no longer need him. They carry his flaw inside them, and it is enough to tear them apart. You notice the rivalry is most in war. One warband arrives to raid a hive city, only to be challenged by another who demands the stage. They fight each other while mortals flee. Their duel more important than victory to the Imperium. It looks like wasted potential. To them, it is pure. Why share glory when you can take it? What frightens you most is how their fragmentation makes them unpredictable. You cannot track them like the Black Legion or the World Eaters. Each warband follows its own logic, its own rhythm. One strikes planets for treasure, another for slaves, another simply to hear the screams echo. You can prepare. For armies, you cannot prepare for chaos without pattern. The Emperor's children once prided themselves on order, symmetry, and harmony. Now, their discord made flesh, and yet in their ears. It still sounds beautiful. You come to the inevitable climax of Fulgrim's path. His ascension. The Emperor's children had long mirrored his flaws. But when Fulgrim rises to daemonhood, he becomes something beyond even their imagination. You watch as a Primarch transforms into a creature no longer bound by flesh, pride, or sanity, hell. Warmasters still debate whether Fulgrim's transformation was earned through devotion or forced through possession. Some claim the demon within the layer blade consumed him entirely, using his body as a chrysalis. Others argue Fulgrim embraced the demon, merging willingly until he was reborn. Historians still argue whether the man Fulgrim still exists, or whether only the demon remains. From where you stand, you see both truths. Fulgrim's form shifts constantly. Sometimes he still looks like the radiant Primarch, face perfect, voice musical. Then the mask slips, and you see the wings sprouting from his back, the serpentine body, the eyes that multiply until you cannot count them. His beauty is unbearable now, not because it inspires, but because it overwhelms. Looking at him too long feels like drowning. You notice the effect on his sons. They fall to their knees in ecstasy, not fear. To them, this is the ultimate proof. Their father has achieved perfection. He is no longer limited by humanity, no longer bound to the material. He has become the embodiment of everything they crave. And if he can ascend, so can they. Here's a disturbing piece of trivia. Some records describe Fulgrim composing entire operas in the warp, performed not with instruments, but with daemonic choirs. His followers claim to hear fragments of these songs in their dreams, melodies so haunting they wake. Bleeding from the ears, true or not? The idea alone fuels his legend. Critics sometimes ask whether Fulgrim's ascension destroyed any chance of redemption. The answer is clear. Yes, a demon Primarch does not turn back. His soul is woven into Slaanesh's tapestry. The man who once sought perfection in battle is now perfection in corruption, and his legion cheers because their own. Torment suddenly feels validated. If Fulgrim is divine in his excess, then their addictions are sacred too. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim retained his mind. Some claim he is cunning, weaving plots across the galaxy. Others insist he is lost in endless indulgence, a prisoner of his god even while exalted. Watching him, you cannot decide. One moment he speaks with clarity, mocking Guilliman or Magnus. The next, he dissolves into laughter that shatters glass. The ascension also seals the Legion's fate. Fulgrim no longer leads as a general. He leads as a symbol, a beacon of what they can become. Warbands fight not to claim worlds, but to catch his attention, to earn his fleeting glance. His approval is more addictive than any drug. His absence is unbearable. And so the Emperor's children spiral even deeper. If their Primarch, once the Emperor's son, can rise to daemonhood, then no limit remains. Pain is not too much. Pleasure is not too far. Mutation is not too grotesque. Every boundary is just another veil to tear away. Fulgrim is no longer their father. He is their godling, a mirror of Slaanesh given a face they still recognize. And they would follow him into the abyss, laughing, screaming, singing, forever. The Emperor's children wander now, not as conquerors but as seekers. You follow their path across the stars and sea. A legion driven not by strategy or ambition, but by hunger for the next experience. They are eternal nomads, always moving, never satisfied. Every battle is a hunt, every raid a performance, every scream a note in their endless song. Lore masters still debate whether this endless search is survival or ritual. Some say the Emperor's children must keep moving or else collapse into madness. From boredom, others argue they wander to spread Slaanesh's influence. Like missionaries of sensation, historians still argue whether their purpose is self-inflicted or divine. Watching them, you realize purpose doesn't matter. The hunger alone drives them. They strike worlds seemingly at random. One day, a hive city falls to their sonic barrages. Another, a rural agri-world collapses into mass hysteria after they descend in ritual. They do not care if targets are strategic. They only care if they offer something new, a sound, a taste, a sight never felt before. Here's an odd piece of trivia. One warband recorded an entire campaign as if it were a concert tour. They named each battle acts and movement, listing planets like stops on a schedule. Survivors even reported posters plastered in occupied cities, advertising the next performance. The campaign killed millions, but for the Emperor's children, it was just another tour. The hunt is not only for a sensation, it is also for validation. You notice how they compete to outdo each other. One warband developing a new form of sonic weapon, another creating elaborate rituals with enslaved mortals, another staging duels mid-battle while ignoring objectives. Each wants to be remembered as more inventive, more indulgent. Critics often compare their wanderings to the Black Legion's grand crusades. But where the Black Legion seeks power, the Emperor's children seek novelty. They will abandon a siege if it becomes boring. They will betray allies if a new opportunity for a spectacle rises. This unpredictability terrifies Imperial commanders. How do you defend a galaxy when your enemy's motive is simply what feels good today? Historians still argue whether Fulgrim directs these wanderings. Some claim his whispers guide them from the warp, pushing them toward worlds ripe for corruption. Others say the warbands act alone, chasing rumors like addicts chasing a new drug. Either way, the effect is the same. Chaos spreading with no pattern, no logic. You feel the exhaustion in their pursuit. The thrill always fades. What once amazed them grows dull. A sound that once made them shiver now barely registers. So they push further. If screams lose flavor, they seek songs of demons. If blood grows common, they demand rivers of it sculpted into art. If sensations dull, they cut deeper, louder, stranger. The hunt never ends because satisfaction never arrives, and in that endless wandering, you glimpse the true torment. They can never rest. They can never stop. Even victory is hollow the moment it ends. What they chase is not conquest, but the fleeting instant of sensation, and the instant always pauses for you, watching. It looks like madness for them. It feels like destiny. You arrive in the aftermath, where the Emperor's children have passed and left their mark. This is where their torment becomes everyone else's. To walk through a world they touched is to walk through silence that feels broken, ruins that seem to alive, and echoes that will not fade. You see their victims, and you understand why Imperial commanders dread their rival. More than most traitor legions, lore masters still debate whether the devastation is deliberate or simply a byproduct of indulgence. Some argue the Emperor's children enjoy sculpting ruin as art. Others insist they are too absorbed in their own frenzy to notice what they destroy. Historians still argue whether the aftermath is tragedy or design. For those who survive, The difference hardly matters. A city struck by them looks strange. Walls crumble not from bombardment, but from resonance, as if the stone itself lost interest in holding together. Streets are littered not only with bodies, but with objects ranged deliberately. Corpses in symmetrical rows, blood spread like brushstrokes across plazas, broken instruments left standing as monuments. This is not war. This is exhibition. Here's a chilling piece of trivia. Survivors on One World reported that the Emperor's children forced entire populations to sing as they died. Millions of voices rose in one final hymn. Conducted by noise marines, the survivors couldn't recall the words, only that the melody haunted them for the rest of their lives. The scars run deeper than buildings. Survivors often describe phantom sounds, whispers at night, distant music in empty air, screams carried by wind that no Vox unit records. Some never recover. Entire populations fall into silence, refusing to speak. Terrified, their voices will summon echoes. Others become obsessed, trying to recreate the sounds they heard. Driven mad when they fail, critics sometimes compare their devastation to that of the world eaters who leave fields of slaughter behind. But you notice the difference. The world eaters leave carnage as evidence of fury. The Emperor's children leave arrangements, reminders. Their ruin is crafted, not random. The message is clear. This was not only destruction, this was performance. Historians still argue whether these performances are meant for mortals, for Fulgrim, or for Slaanesh itself. Perhaps all three, perhaps none. Watching the ruins, you suspect the answer is simpler. They create because they cannot stop. They must turn every act into sensation, even after the act is over. For the Imperium, the aftermath is more dangerous than the attack. How do you rebuild a world when survivors flinch at sound? How do you repopulate a city when no one dares to speak above a whisper? The Emperor's children do not just break stone. They break culture. They erode hope, and the victims often carry the corruption forward. A guardsman who survived one of their battles might hum a tune without realizing it's warped. A noble family might treasure a piece of artwork left behind. Not knowing it whispers, a child might copy patterns from a ruined fresco, spreading the mark unknowingly. Their aftermath is contagion, as subtle as it is loud. You see now that the Emperor's children do not fight wars, they stage plagues of sensation. And the echoes never fade, not for the worlds they scar, not for the souls who survive. The silence after their passing is never true silence. It is waiting. You come to the end, and it is fitting that it feels unfinished. The Emperor's children live in torment not because they lost, but because they cannot stop winning against themselves. They are trapped in a loop of craving, chasing a perfection that dissolves the moment they touch it. Their fate is not glorious, not even tragic. It is endless. Lore masters still debate whether this is the worst punishment a legion could suffer. Some say to serve Khorne and die in rage is at least simple. To rot with Nurgle is at least stable. To weave plots for Tzin Shizat, least purposeful. But to serve Slaanesh is to be devoured forever by your own hunger. Historians still argue whether the Emperor's children even realize their torment, or if they are too consumed to carve. Watching them, you see glimpses of both. Moments of clarity where they remember loyalty, regret, or shame. Then laughter drowns it out, and the craving resumes. Every part of their life is twisted into torment. A bolter becomes an instrument, a scar becomes a prize, a battle becomes a theater. They cannot act without performing. They cannot feel without amplifying. Even silence torments them. Silence is absence, and absence is pain. Here's a bitter piece of trivia. Some captured noise marines, briefly restrained, begged not for freedom but for sound. Deprived of noise, they convulsed, their bodies rejecting stillness like poison. Some died in silence, their hearts simply stopping. Their addiction is not metaphor. It is physical law to them now. Critics often ask whether redemption is possible. Could the Emperor's children ever return to loyalty if Fulgrim himself renounced Slaanesh? But you know the truth. Redemption requires rest, reflection, and choice. The Emperor's children have none. Of those, they cannot rest, they cannot reflect, and their choices are dictated by hunger. Historians still argue whether Fulgrim's ascension cursed his sons, or whether they cursed themselves. The truth is less dramatic. Both. He embodied the flaw, they amplified it, and together they locked themselves into eternity. The price of perfection is not glory. It is torment. They are eternal. Addicts, never sated, never at peace, they are damned not because they fell, but because they cannot stop falling, even now. And when you hear their echoes across the stars, you realize the torment. Wind down 300 words, the noise softens now, fading like echoes in a cathedral after the choir has left. You step out of the ruins they leave behind, and the silence feels heavier than any scream. The Emperor's children are gone, but you know they will return. They always return, because their hunger does not let them rest. You think back on Fulgrim, on the pride that bloomed into obsession, on the blade that whispered too sweetly, on the sons who copied their father until they lost themselves. It is tempting to frame it as tragedy, a fall from grace. But what you saw was not a fall. It was a spiral, and spirals never end. The Imperium teaches you to fear demons, heretics, traitors. But the Emperor's children show you something worse, the enemy who laughs while dying, who thanks you for hurting him, who cannot be stopped because stopping is the one thing he cannot endure. They remind you that perfection itself can be poison, that beauty can rot, and that noise can smother thought. Perhaps you feel pity, perhaps you feel horror, perhaps both. That is the truth of their torment. It lingers with you, makes you question whether you could resist the same whispers. If they sang to you, so let the echoes fade. Let the silence return, heavy and unwelcome. And as the stars shift and the Imperium endures one more gray day, remember that somewhere out there, a noise marine is tuning his weapon. A warband is choosing its next stage, and Fulgrim is laughing in a voice that bends reality. Sleep lightly, for the music always finds an audience.